Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Schultz. I am the Water Education Specialist with the California Department of Water Resources. Welcome to our special Halloween Water Wednesday. In the spirit of Halloween, today we will be talking about vampires. No, wait, vampire fish. And they live right here in California. Our story takes us into the San Francisco Estuary, more commonly known as the San Francisco Bay. And we will be hearing the strange tale of how a young scientist discovered a vampire fish where they were not thought to be, and how she investigated this strange phenomena and what she discovered. The mission of the California Department of Water Resources is to sustainably manage the water resources of California in cooperation with other agencies to benefit the state's people and protect, restore, and enhance the natural and human environments. Our speaker today comes from one of those other agencies. Pascale Gertler is an environmental scientist who works at the Delta Stewardship Council, and she will be telling you her story. Before we start with Pascale's story, I just want to go through a few logistics. By now, Zoom meetings are as common as carved pumpkins are in October. But in case you are joining us for the first time, we have asked you to turn off your cameras and your audio. This is to remove the distractions, any little ghouls or ghosts or goblins that may be running around your house and trying to jump in while the program is going. But we really do want to hear from you. So there's the famous Zoom chat box. Down at the bottom of your screen, you just find the little button that says chat. Hover over it with your cursor. Looks like a little speech bubble, and you can pose any questions that you have about these vampire fish to Pascale. We also have closed captions available during our presentation. If you'd like to see what is being said, you simply go to the right of the chat box where it says closed caption. It's a dark box with the letters CC in it, and click on that and you can see the captions. Pascale is actually attending a conference today specifically on these fish. So she's recorded her presentation already, but she will be joining us for the questions afterward. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over now, and Pascale will be telling you about the murky mysteries of young lamprey in the San Francisco Estuary.
Hello! As Kathy mentioned, my name is Pascale, and I'm an ecologist who works with fish that travel great distances and are eaten by people. In California, where I live and work, we share the rivers, estuary, and ocean with three native groups of fish that I study most often: salmon, sturgeon, and lamprey. My research aims to better understand how to balance human and fish needs for the environment, particularly in estuaries. I'm also very interested in data and statistics, and work together with other scientists to combine our data for a broader view of these fish and their habitats. But today I'll be talking to you about the murky mysteries of young lamprey in the San Francisco Estuary. Early one morning, and with the light from headlamps guiding my way, I set out with a group of scientists on a boat to study predatory fish in the freshwater San Francisco Estuary, also called the Delta. Gathering data for this study required us to stretch a net across the channel to capture large fish. As I pulled up the anchor used to secure the net to the muddy channel bottom, I noticed something wriggling in my hand. I called over to the other scientists on the boat, and together we identified the wriggling mud as a larval or immature lamprey. After carefully returning the young fish to the water, I wondered to myself, what was a larval lamprey doing in the Delta? And if you were to shine a light on our discovery of a larval lamprey that early morning in the Delta, this is what you might see. Can you see me at the front, pulling the anchor out of the mud? If you're wondering what a wriggling larval lamprey looks like, I have a video for you here. See that wriggle? Now, lamprey are ancient fish without jaws, bones, or scales, and they appeared on Earth before us and even before the dinosaurs. In addition to being an ancient fish, lamprey also migrate great distances and use the rivers and ocean to complete their life, which is called anadromy. As an example, when rain falls, it collects into creeks and rivers, which connect to each other and drain into the estuary and ocean, which you can see here. Like raindrops, anadromous lamprey also travel from the creeks and rivers where they are born downstream to estuaries and ultimately the Pacific Ocean. So if we think about this in the context of the lamprey life cycle, there are 4 primary stages. Do you see the numbers? 1, 2, 3, and 4? While in freshwater and in this first larval stage, lamprey burrow their eyeless bodies tail first into the mud or sand and filter feed by sucking in water and filtering out tiny organisms and decaying matter to eat. Larval lamprey are thought to remain in freshwater for up to 7 years, after which they begin metamorphosis, which is a physical transformation from one distinct life stage to the next. In lamprey, this transformation from larval to juvenile stages is stage 2, where their eyes fully emerge and they develop complex sucking mouthparts. In stage 3, juvenile lamprey also become free swimming, which allows lamprey to migrate to the ocean and parasitize larger fish by attaching to the side of their bodies and feeding off their blood. Parasitism is a type of relationship where one organism, the parasite, benefits from the other, the host, who is harmed. For lamprey, the hosts are often other migratory fish like salmon and sturgeon. Did you know that 40% of animals on Earth are parasitic, including the fictional vampire? When lamprey have grown large enough, they enter this 4th stage. They return to the creeks and rivers to spawn, releasing eggs and sperm into the water and gravel, which creates the next generation of lamprey. Can you see the adult lamprey in the video? Can you see them removing the rocks from the nest? This understanding of the lamprey anadromous life cycle conflicted with my experience finding a larval lamprey in the delta, so I decided to investigate further. If the larval lamprey I discovered in the delta was there by mistake, then there would be very little evidence of other larval lamprey collected in the estuary. To do this, I consulted with the scientific method, which you may have heard before. It starts with an observation, which leads to a question, hypotheses, experiments, analyses, and hopefully conclusions. I began speaking with other scientists sampling in benthic habitats of the estuary where larval lamprey might be found. Now, benthic is anything associated with or occurring on the bottom of a water body. I discovered that other scientists were also accidentally collecting larval lamprey in the estuary, but no one had thought to look at all the data together. So if we're thinking about the scientific method, that early morning discovery was my observation. Next, I asked myself, what was a larval lamprey doing in the delta? Now, as a scientist, after this initial curiosity, I need to develop my hypotheses, which are proposed explanations that can be confirmed by scientific tests. Now, if we think more broadly about our question, it's about a baby lamprey. And in the wild, babies are often born at very specific times of year. The coincidence of young animals and natural resources is thought to be a strategy for enhanced growth and survival. Rapid growth is very important for young animals in this very vulnerable life stage. For some fish species, estuaries are nurseries for young fish to grow before traveling to the ocean. Swimming to the ocean can be very dangerous for young fish because large fish, birds, and mammals they encounter in the ocean may eat them. Taking time to grow large while in the estuary can be very important for the survival of young fish. After talking with some colleagues, I assembled a team of researchers interested in understanding where larval lamprey had been found in the estuary and why they were there. Together, we developed a 2-part hypothesis. If young lamprey use the estuary as a nursery, then first, they'll be found often, and second, they'll be found in places best suited for their development. To test our hypothesis, we started by conducting a data synthesis. We gathered existing data on lamprey catch and habitat conditions collected by other scientists in the estuary. We found that lamprey were caught in all datasets compiled and across all areas of the estuary. Hypothesis 1 accepted. Although there were many gaps in the data, our synthesis also taught us that there are 3 different species of lamprey in the estuary. Can you see their teeth? That's how we can tell them apart. 2 of these species, Pacific lamprey and Western river lamprey, are anadromous and parasitized host fish while living in the estuary and ocean. The 3rd species, Western brook lamprey, on the bottom there, is not anadromous or parasitic. Instead, this species lives only in freshwater. Freshwater lamprey that are not parasitic spend most of their lives filter feeding. As adults, western brook lamprey do not parasitize other fish. In fact, adults don't feed at all. Instead, they live off the energy stored in their bodies during their filter feeding stage of their life. This life strategy allows lamprey to live in small streams from which swimming to the ocean may not always be possible. Once we discovered that several species of lamprey lived in the estuary, we examined our second hypothesis, that young lamprey preferred certain areas of the estuary. Our team applied a mathematical model to the data to determine the probability of young lamprey present in different areas of the estuary. A probability is how likely an event is to occur. The value of a probability is a number between 0 and 1, where 0 is impossible and 1 is certain, or 100%. The model revealed that young lamprey were found in some places more than others. Warmer colors on this map of the estuary are a signal of places with the highest chance of lamprey, and cooler colors in the map indicate that lamprey were not likely to be found in that area. For example, the green in San Pablo Bay means that there's a 25% chance, or 1 out of 4 chance, of capturing a young lamprey in the San Pablo Bay. The map shows that there is a greater chance that young lamprey would be in the Sacramento River or the confluence of the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers in orange and yellow. The model also showed that the probability of young lamprey living in the San Francisco Bay and lower San Joaquin River was very low, areas in blue, indicating that lamprey may require specific habitat conditions to thrive. The mathematical model also taught us that young lamprey were more likely to be where water temperatures are cooler. This graph shows the probability of young lamprey presence at different water temperatures and areas in the estuary. For example, that horizontal line at 0.75 is a probability of 0.75, or 75%, 3 out of 4 chance of capturing young lamprey in that area and at that temperature. Like many fish species, the energy required for a lamprey to survive is controlled by temperature. Warmer water temperatures that sometimes occur in the estuary may stress or harm lamprey. If young lamprey use the estuary as a nursery, then this figure shows us that cooler temperatures in the lower Sacramento River and confluence of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers, the two darkest lines, may be important places for them to develop. Like most studies, there are questions left unanswered and new questions to be asked. Although we discovered where young lamprey were most likely to be within the estuary, it's still not clear what young lamprey were doing there. The data we compiled was missing details on developmental stage of each lamprey collected. It may be that larval lamprey feed and grow in the estuary, whereas juvenile lamprey only enter the estuary on their way to the ocean. We cannot know for certain that the young lamprey we found in the estuary were using the estuary as a nursery, or if they were simply traveling to the ocean. Scientists can continue to investigate these unanswered questions by collecting more consistent data to determine what specific habitats lamprey prefer during each of their life stages. And as you can see, the scientific method goes on in a circle. As we keep asking questions and answering them, new questions always come up. Now finally, in some places lamprey have a very bad reputation, but they're an important part of the native fish community in California. Now that we have more information on where lamprey live in the estuary, we can focus efforts to protect those areas for future lamprey. California populations are thought to be in decline, and habitat changes and destruction have already restricted known populations to limited areas with less than ideal habitat. Understanding how young lamprey respond to warmer water temperatures may be critical for protecting these species, and as more questions are answered about lamprey habitat use, more information will be available to help improve and expand existing habitat. This is important because lamprey provide many benefits to the environment. For example, larval lamprey feed by filtering tiny organisms and decaying matter out of the water, which helps keeps water clear. Lamprey are also food for other animals, including humans. Protecting lamprey not only keeps them around for us to study, but it also helps preserve the ecosystem that relies on their services. I also wanted to finish by pointing out this article. If you're interested in more information on the study, it is published and freely available online and will be linked with this video. Thank you for your attention and happy Halloween.
Great, thank you. That was super interesting. And I'm going to invite Pascal will join us to answer some of the questions that have been coming in through the chat box. Hey, Pascal.
Hello.
Good to see you again. It was really, really cool. So we've got a whole bunch of questions coming in, but I just want to touch on that last piece that you mentioned about the lamprey. You mentioned that they sort of get a bad reputation, but they're part of our native community here in California, because when I was Googling lamprey, kind of looking stuff up before the presentation today, everything that came up talked about these, invasive species in the Great Lakes, but the ones that you're talking about, they're part of the ecosystem here in California, right?
Yes, they're native here,
Okay.
not in the Great Lakes. Mm-hmm.
And all right, let's see, what are people wanting to know about the lamprey? How do we know that lamprey have been here since before the dinosaurs, or do we find them in the fossil record?
That is a good question. I assume so. Yeah.
Okay, so they're bony. Are they bony fish?
No, they're more like sharks. They're but I think that the teeth.
Yes, those teeth. those are some very distinct looking teeth, aren't they?
Yes.
How big do the lamprey that we find here in Northern California get?
Pacific lamprey are the biggest, and they get several feet long. I'm not sure exactly what the maximum size is for Pacific lamprey.
What's the biggest one you've seen, or have you just seen the juveniles?
I primarily see the juveniles. I primarily study babies, but the largest one I ever saw was at the Fremont Weir and the Yola Bypass, and it was probably 2.5 feet long.
Okay, that's a pretty good size, long, snaky like fish.
Yeah, and I believe that the Feather River, Oroville has some pictures on their website, the DWR Oroville page.
Okay. So you mentioned that the lamprey are parasitic. What happens if they don't find a host?
Well, they would probably die. All of us need to eat, right? And so if they can't find a host, then they can't eat.
One of our viewers wants to know if there's any concern of being attacked by a lamprey as a person.
No, I've held them before and they've never bitten me. They're not interested in us. They just want to get away.
They prefer the salmon, and did you say also sturgeon?
Mm-hmm. And other fish in the ocean as well. Okay.
How far up the Sacramento River have the lamprey been found? Do you know?
They can get all the way up to the dams, and then they're blocked by the dams. But originally they went up into the headwaters, and there are lamprey like the western brook lamprey that don't migrate up all the way up into Goose Lake at the very top of the historic Sacramento watershed.
Okay, all right. So just like they pretty much had the same range as salmon. Oh, I guess they still do because they're stopped by the dam.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And we saw the picture of the lamprey sort of making a nest in the rocks. Do salmon and lamprey lay their eggs at the same time, or are they looking for good spots in the rocks at different time?
Yeah, so salmon are in the system pretty much all the time. What's something that's really interesting about the Sacramento San Joaquin watershed is that we have 4 runs of salmon, winter, spring, fall, and late fall. And then there's also steelhead that are spawning. So yeah, lamprey and salmon and different salmon species are overlapping in their spawning. There's still a lot to be learned about lamprey. There's some recent studies in the Klamath that shows that they may have different runs just like salmon do, but that's very early research and we're still trying to understand them.
Is there very much research on lamprey?
Not compared to salmon, no. Much less. They're not as charismatic. And they're not eaten by as many people, although people do eat lamprey.
Mm-hmm. Right, they're a significant part of traditional Native American diets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any environmental laws protecting lamprey at this time?
There's some work on passage for lamprey. They need different structures than salmon, and sturgeon also need different structures for passage. So there is some work to incorporate them into passage structures. But they are not listed on the Endangered Species Act the way salmon and sturgeon are.
Okay. So there's, you said that up to like 40% of all living creatures are parasitic. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
What are some other examples of parasites?
Let's see, leeches,
Mm-hmm.
mosquitoes,
Definitely.
other parasites. That's a good question. I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Mistletoe.
Yeah.
We've got plant parasites too.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So when you're looking at the lamprey, why is it important to know when they're in the delta? Why did you kind of do this meta-analysis, this study?
Well, there wasn't a lot of documentation on lamprey using estuaries, specifically the amicetes, the larval lamprey, which rear for, like I said, a long time. So if they are rearing in the estuary, then maybe that's something we need to consider when we're doing habitat restoration or other actions that impact the sediment where we would expect to find lamprey. So there is work on clam biomass in the Central Valley, and that's actually the first data set that I used was a clam data set to try to understand where lamprey might be. But other than that, we don't really think about the benthic habitats as often as maybe we do the pelagic, like the waterways.
Do you know, is there an agency that's building passage structures for the lamprey right now, or is that something that's being looked into?
I believe that DWR is looking into some of that at the Fremont where I said the place that I've seen adult lamprey, they do get stranded there, and they're very difficult to capture because they're strong and they will suck on to the weir. And it's hard to get them off. So, and I also believe there's a number of like culverts and things like that where if there's a lip on the culvert, the lamprey can't get over it, but if there isn't one, then they can climb. And so just creating structures where they can climb sometimes is a really simple thing to do. And it's a way to give lamprey access.
So they can use their mouth and like suction onto something and then climb with it?
They climb waterfalls. That's how they get into the upper reaches of rivers.
So like we see pictures of salmon doing that big, jump up the waterfalls. So lamprey don't do the jump. They kind of slurp their way up it, I guess.
Yeah, they still do some jumping, I think. And then they suction on, and then they kind of jump, and then they suction on.
Okay, that would be something to see.
Yeah, I think that you can see some pictures of that on the Willamette River, which is a tributary to the Columbia. They have a famous place where lamprey cross there.
Got it. Up in Oregon.
Right.
So somebody just sent a message in saying that lamprey fossils have been found in Mongolia dating back to 125 million years ago. So
very interesting.
Mongolia and China are definitely a good place to find those old fossils. So something's showing up in the fossil record. When the lamprey attach to the fish, can more than one attach at a time?
Yeah, there's no reason why they wouldn't. I mean, you don't want to overburden your host as a parasite. It's not a useful strategy. You want them to live so you can continue to suck their blood, right? But yeah, more than one can. I've seen more than one injury on a steelhead before. More than one. It's like a bite, a circular bite that you can see on them from lamprey.
So do some of the lamprey suck and some bite, or do they suck and then bite? Because you mentioned them sucking on the rocks to kind of move up the waterfalls or under the bottom of the weirs.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the physiology of exactly how they get in there. I do think that some of them will rip off pieces of muscle, whereas others will suck the blood
Right. And then you mentioned there's
Different
another
species have different strategies.
and then you mentioned there's another that's a filter feeder. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the non-parasitic, and also the majority of their lives when they're juveniles, when they're in the river, they are filter feeding. So they're almost like a clam,
Okay.
like a bivalve.
What eats a lamprey? Do they have predators?
Yeah, lots of things eat them. They have a high lipid content, so they're very tasty. I've never tried one, but they're supposed to be very tasty. So yeah, other fish eat them, like striped bass and salmon and sturgeon, and sea lions also eat them. So they are definitely prey. For the majority of their lives, they're prey.
For the majority of their lives. So it's actually the salmon will eat them, but then they'll turn around and take a bite out of the salmon.
Well, I think the salmon usually eat the juveniles.
Uh-huh.
They're not necessarily gonna get an adult. Although people do catch the adults and use them for bait also for sturgeon.
Okay.
And sturgeon will dig up the babies.
Okay. So some of the fishing lures that people use, the ones that are kind of long and squiggly looking, are those made to look like lamprey?
Yeah, so the lures that you use for striped bass
Mhm.
are meant to look like lamprey amicetes, the larval lamprey.
Okay.
They're also likely slower than salmon, so they may be an easier thing to eat. If both juvenile lamprey and juvenile salmon are leaving the river at the same time, it may be easier and higher lipid content to get a lamprey if
Okay.
you're a predator.
So you mentioned I think you said the lamprey aren't necessarily listed right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's not enough information to make a status, but we do think that they're in decline because they have lost similar habitat as other species that are in decline, like the salmon and sturgeon.
Okay, so it sounds like a great topic of research for somebody who wants to maybe get a degree in fisheries or fish biology or something like that.
There's a lot still to know about lamprey.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Pascal, for coming and joining us today. And I want to thank everybody at home who joined us today too. As I mentioned at the start of this, today is our special Halloween Water Wednesday, which means that November is upon us. And November is a really busy month. We have an election coming up. We have Veterans Day. We have Thanksgiving. And then that brings us into December, which we all know is an incredibly busy month as well. So due to that, we're actually going to put Water Wednesday on hiatus, and we will be back on January 6th. So we'll be back in 2021. But in the meantime, you can a lot of opportunities to keep learning more if you're interested. You can always visit our website, water.ca.gov. And we have a number of free education materials that parents and teachers can order. Nothing on lamprey at this point, but a whole bunch of other really interesting workbooks and booklets and things to do around your house to help conserve water. And then if you do want to learn more about lamprey, you can visit websites at ucdavis.edu and also California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we'll put both of these links in our in the chat box, in the comments box on our YouTube channel. So you don't need to write them down right now, but both of these have some really good information on our native California lamprey. And then if you want to catch up on some of our past Water Wednesdays, everything is available on our YouTube channel. We've got Delta Ecology, our summer water sources, salmon, floods, and of course, Pascal's presentation. And our friends over at the Nimbus Hatchery are going to be doing a 4-part webinar series starting next week on salmon. This will be live from the Nimbus Hatchery during salmon spawning season. And you need to register in advance for their webinars. And you can do that at wildlife.ca.gov/learning/resources. And those will be on Thursdays, with the exception of Thanksgiving week when they'll move it to Wednesday. So there's lots of opportunities to keep learning about California water and what lives in the water until we come back in January. So we hope that you will join us back again then. and continue to follow us on our social media channels. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and of course, we have our videos on YouTube. I want to wish everybody a very, very happy and safe ending to 2020. Thank you again, Pascal, for joining us today and helping close out our 2020 Water Wednesday season. And we look forward to seeing everybody back here in the new year. Bye-bye.